The first time I unlocked a forgotten storage room beneath an abandoned public library, I expected to find nothing more than dust and broken furniture, but instead, I uncovered a faded leather journal that carried my late mother's full name on the first page, even though she had always sworn she had never stepped inside that building. As I stood frozen beneath the weak glow of a flickering light, my hands trembled around the journal, because every belief I had about my family suddenly felt uncertain, and I realized that some secrets survive far longer than the people who try to bury them. My name is Ethan Carter, and by the age of 28 I had convinced myself that my quiet life in the small mountain town of Ashridge would never change in any meaningful way, because I spent my weekdays restoring historic buildings and my evenings alone inside a modest apartment filled with old blueprints, antique clocks, and memories that seemed impossible to escape. Ever since my mother passed away after a long illness 3 years earlier, I carried an ache that never fully disappeared, especially because she had left behind so many unanswered questions about my father, a man I had never met and whose identity remained nothing more than an empty space on my birth certificate. Everything began on a rainy Tuesday morning, when the Ashridge Historical Society hired my restoration company to inspect the basement of the town's century-old public library before a major renovation project could begin, and I gladly accepted because restoring forgotten places always made me feel as though I was giving forgotten stories another chance to breathe. The building smelled of aged timber, worn stone, and weathered paper, while every hallway echoed with silence that somehow felt alive, making me wonder how many lives had quietly crossed those floors over the last 100 years without leaving behind anything except fragile memories. The library director handed me an old brass key attached to a cracked wooden tag marked Storage Room C, explaining that no employee could remember the last time anyone had opened the forgotten space because the lock had remained untouched for decades after repeated floods damaged the lower level. I carefully descended the narrow stone staircase with my flashlight cutting through the darkness, feeling an odd sense of anticipation that I could not explain as every step echoed through the damp hallway like distant footsteps following behind me. After forcing the swollen wooden door open, I found rows of broken shelves, rusted filing cabinets, and stacks of water-stained boxes that had collapsed into one another over the years, creating a maze of forgotten records and abandoned history, waiting to be uncovered. While documenting everything for the restoration report, I noticed a small cedar chest tucked beneath a collapsed cabinet, and unlike everything else in the room, it was unusually clean, as though someone had deliberately protected it from time itself. The chest was secured with a simple leather strap that crumbled the moment I touched it, revealing several neatly folded letters, a silver compass with unusual markings around its edge, and a weathered journal whose cover had faded almost beyond recognition after years of neglect. My pulse quickened when I opened the first page because written in elegant handwriting was the name Evelyn Carter, my mother's full name, followed by a date that was nearly 12 years before I had been born, making it impossible to understand how the journal had ended up hidden inside this forgotten room. For several long minutes I simply stared at the pages without turning another one, because my mother had always insisted she had grown up hundreds of miles away and had never visited Ashridge until shortly before I was born, repeating that same story every time I became curious about our past. Finding her personal journal inside a locked room beneath the oldest building in town shattered that familiar version of history, leaving me with the uneasy feeling that every answer I had trusted was beginning to fall apart before my eyes. I slipped the journal into my backpack and finished documenting the basement, but my thoughts never returned to the renovation project because every few minutes I found myself touching the worn leather cover just to make sure it was real and not some impossible dream created by grief. The drive home felt unusually long as heavy clouds gathered over the mountains, and by the time I unlocked my apartment door I had already decided that nothing else in my life mattered until I discovered why my mother had hidden such an important piece of her past. After making a cup of coffee that quickly grew cold beside me, I carefully opened the journal and began reading the first pages, expecting ordinary diary entries about work or daily life. Yet what I found instead was a detailed account of a secret restoration project involving an abandoned estate outside Ashridge that had officially disappeared from county records many years earlier. My mother described working alongside a small team of historians who believed the mansion concealed documents capable of changing the history of one of the region's most influential families, But she stopped writing abruptly just as the investigation seemed to become dangerous. Tucked between two faded pages was an old photograph showing 5 smiling young adults standing in front of a magnificent stone mansion surrounded by towering pine trees. And although time had faded the colors, I immediately recognized my mother standing near the center with a confidence I had never seen in her later years. Beside her stood a tall man wearing a dark field jacket and holding the same silver compass I had found inside the cedar chest, while both of them looked directly into the camera with expressions that suggested they shared a secret too important to speak aloud. As I turned the photograph over, my breath caught when I noticed a short handwritten message across the back that read, "If anything happens to us, trust Nathan Holloway because he knows the whole truth," followed by a phone number that had been crossed out several times before disappearing beneath faded ink. I searched the name online without expecting much, but within seconds I found an article identifying Nathan Holloway as a retired investigative journalist who still lived in a quiet lakeside town less than 2 hours from Ashridge, and something deep inside me whispered that meeting him would change my life forever. I barely slept that night because every time I closed my eyes I saw my mother's smile in that old photograph, a smile completely different from the tired expression I remembered during the final years of her illness, and I could not stop wondering what had stolen that happiness from her life. Before sunrise I packed the journal, the silver compass, and the faded photograph into my backpack, locked my apartment, and started the long drive toward the quiet lakeside town where Nathan Holloway was rumored to be living in retirement. The journey carried me through winding mountain roads and dense forests that seemed untouched by time, while the questions inside my head grew louder with every passing mile until they drowned out the sound of the engine itself. When I finally reached the peaceful little town, I found a modest wooden cottage overlooking the lake, where an elderly man with gray hair was repairing an old fishing boat as though he had been expecting no visitors at all. I introduced myself politely and watched his calm expression disappear the instant I placed the worn journal and faded photograph on the wooden table beside him, because the color drained from his face as though he had seen a ghost rise from the past. He picked up the photograph with shaking hands, stared at my mother for several silent moments, and quietly whispered that he had spent more than 20 years believing everyone connected to that investigation had either disappeared or chosen never to speak about it again. Nathan invited me inside, poured 2 cups of hot coffee, and remained silent until the room settled into complete stillness before finally looking directly into my eyes with an expression filled with both regret and determination. He slowly admitted that my mother had never been running from a place or a person, but from a dangerous truth powerful enough to destroy influential lives, and he warned me that if I insisted on uncovering the rest of the story, there would be no turning back once the first hidden door was opened. Nathan leaned back in his chair and remained silent for several moments, as though carefully deciding how much of the truth I was prepared to hear, before finally admitting that more than 30 years earlier my mother had joined a confidential historical preservation team investigating the abandoned Hawthorne estate after workers accidentally discovered a hidden underground archive during restoration. According to him, everyone believed they were documenting forgotten local history, but they soon realized the collection contained personal journals, legal records, and handwritten agreements that exposed decades of corruption involving several of the wealthiest families in the region. I struggled to process everything as Nathan carefully opened my mother's journal and pointed to several pages where names had been replaced with strange symbols and coded sketches instead of ordinary writing, explaining that she had deliberately disguised important details because she feared the journals might fall into the wrong hands. He quietly confessed that every member of the investigation had agreed to separate the evidence into different locations after receiving anonymous threats, believing that protecting the truth was more important than exposing it immediately if innocent lives would be placed in danger. My heart raced as Nathan unlocked an old wooden cabinet and removed a weathered map with faded red markings stretching across several neighboring counties, showing a network of forgotten churches, abandoned train depots, and historic buildings connected by handwritten notes that matched the symbols inside my mother's journal. He traced one location with his finger before looking directly at me and saying that only one archive had never been recovered, because the final collection disappeared on the same night my mother vanished from the investigation and started an entirely new life under complete silence. Before I could ask another question, The peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the sound of tires crunching across the gravel driveway outside the cottage, followed by two unfamiliar black vehicles stopping near the front gate with unsettling precision. Nathan slowly pulled back the curtain, his expression turning pale as he recognized the visitors immediately, then turned toward me and spoke in a steady but urgent voice, saying that the people outside had spent decades searching for the missing archive and that they could never discover I was carrying the one journal capable of leading them straight to it. Nathan wasted no time because he understood exactly who had arrived outside his cottage, and he quickly guided me through a narrow hallway into a concealed room hidden behind an old bookcase where shelves were filled with carefully labeled folders, photographs, and sealed evidence collected over decades. He explained that he had quietly continued investigating after everyone else disappeared, hoping that one day someone connected to the original team would return to finish what they had started, and he believed that person was now standing in front of him. Before the visitors could reach the front porch, Nathan handed me a small metal key, wrapped inside a folded note that contained the address of an abandoned railway station several miles outside town, explaining that the final archive had never been hidden inside a mansion at all because my mother had secretly moved everything shortly before she vanished from the investigation. He urged me to leave through a rear path leading into the woods while he remained behind to delay anyone searching for the journal, promising that the truth deserved to survive even if it cost him everything. I followed the narrow trail through thick trees until I reached my truck, then drove straight toward the forgotten railway station where crumbling brick walls and rusted tracks stretched beneath a gray evening sky that seemed as heavy as my thoughts. After searching the deserted platform for nearly an hour, I found an old maintenance locker hidden beneath loose floorboards, and the key Nathan had given me unlocked it with a single quiet click that echoed through the empty building. Inside the locker rested several waterproof containers packed with original journals, photographs, property records, audio tapes, and signed legal documents that exposed years of fraud, illegal land seizures, and stolen historical artifacts committed by powerful business leaders who had built respected public reputations while secretly destroying countless families. At the very bottom of the collection was a sealed envelope, addressed to me in my mother's unmistakable handwriting, and as I opened it with trembling hands, I felt as though she had somehow reached across time to speak directly to me one final time. Her letter explained that she never stayed silent because she was afraid of the truth itself, but because she feared that exposing dangerous people too early would place everyone she loved in terrible danger, and she hoped that one day I would be old enough, strong enough, and wise enough to finish the journey she could never complete. She wrote that real courage was not measured by revenge or anger but by choosing honesty even when it demanded great sacrifice, and she trusted that I would protect the innocent while allowing the truth to finally come into the light. Within weeks the evidence was delivered to federal investigators, respected journalists, and historical preservation officials who carefully verified every document before making the findings public, leading to criminal investigations, recovered properties, and long overdue justice for families whose voices had been ignored for generations. Nathan was publicly recognized for preserving the evidence despite years of pressure to destroy it, and although he never wanted praise, he smiled with quiet relief because he knew the promise he had made to my mother had finally been fulfilled. As life slowly returned to normal, I remained in Ashridge and expanded my restoration business into a company dedicated to saving historic landmarks and preserving forgotten stories, so that future generations would never lose the lessons hidden inside the past. Every time I unlock the door to another abandoned building, I remember that extraordinary discoveries are often waiting behind ordinary doors, and I carry my mother's journal beside me as a reminder that truth may sleep for many years, but it never disappears forever. Thank you for joining me on this unforgettable journey from mystery to hope.